Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another video in my series on legal practice, the different forms of practice that you can choose when you get to law school, and the different career trajectories that you can take. I am joined today by Maitreya Badami, who is an assistant professor at Chico State University. She's also a supervising attorney in the CLIC program, that is their clinical legal education program. So welcome, Maitreya. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Maitreya, I've asked you here today because although you and I share an academic background, you spent a significant number of years as a criminal defender. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, I spent 23 years practicing criminal law, 16 of which were straight criminal defense in trial and appellate court, and about 8 years, 7.5, 8 years at the Northern California Innocence Project, which is a post-conviction law clinic at Santa Clara University Law School.
Awesome. So why don't you tell us just a little bit in terms of your background as to how you got there? So where did you go to undergrad? Where did you go to law school? How did you ultimately get down this path?
Yeah, I went to the University of Georgia undergrad in Athens, Georgia, and it's a big school. And then I was a political science major there, and I had a plan to go to law school since, I was a kid. Which is a funny thing, there was no one I knew at all who was a lawyer, but people told me from about the age of 7 or 8 that, people who argued as much as I did should be lawyers. Like, I just got that line and I took it seriously. And I was like, okay, that's what I'll do. And so I was kind of on a trajectory to go to law school for a really long time without actually knowing what lawyers did, except for from TV and stuff, which is really not very accurate.
Yeah.
So I went to college to be a lawyer. I graduated, spent 1 year waiting tables, and then I went to the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, which at the time was called Bold Hall, but now it's called Berkeley Law, rebranded. And I was there from 1991 to 1994. It's a 3-year program. Graduated in 94, took the California bar and passed it, and started practicing in 1994.
So in terms of your initial practice, so you left law school, how did you immediately jump into criminal work? Was that, did you take like an internship during law school?
Yeah, so so the way, and when I got to law school, I did not actually have a very clear idea of what type of law I wanted to practice. I didn't really know about the law, honestly. And I got kind of disillusioned pretty quickly. I didn't actually find that I liked it. After it had been my goal for so long, I got there and I found it overwhelming. And I also found it both overwhelming and stressful and boring. Like, I didn't really like it at all. Yeah. And which is funny. So in my second year of law school, while I still didn't really quite know what I wanted to do, an opportunity came up to do a judicial externship. So it was a whole semester where instead of classes, there's just the one externship related class that you go to. I think it was weekly, but all the rest of it, there were no other classes except you worked full time, like a 40-hour week, working for a federal district court judge. So a trial judge in the federal district court in San Francisco. So I would take the BART in from Berkeley, and the externs, there were 2 of us. We worked on the prison, the unrepresented prisoner litigation. So they're called in pro per litigants. They're inmates who have either civil rights claims, or they could have habeas corpus claims, like trying to change something about their sentence or their conviction. They're representing themselves. And they send a lot of paperwork to the courts. So in order to spend their resources on the cases that were going to go somewhere, they would put the externs on these mostly frivolous, occasionally meritorious claims, and that we would be doing research and sort of advising the judge if there was any reason the judge really needed to take any action in the different prisoner cases. And while I was doing this externship, the judge would allow us to watch court in his law and motion calendar it was like our gift for doing this really kind of overwhelming and sad work. We could watch court. And then we watched these motions in this criminal case, a federal criminal case. Is very interesting to me. Just let's be real. It was a 72-ton hashish importation case.
Holy cow.
With lots of video of the takedown by the Coast Guard of the ship, and like on the high seas in a storm, like very dramatic stuff. And over the course of my semester, the different lawyers, there were multiple defendants involved in the case. Many people were charged from different countries, a few Americans, Canadians, Dutch people were the financiers that came from Pakistan. So it was very, and each week at Law in Motion, there would be fewer defendants because they would plead guilty in exchange for deals or to cooperate with the government against the remaining defendants. And so it was very dramatic. Over the course of the semester, we watched it whittle down to just 2 defendants with 3 total lawyers. One of them pled out at the very last minute, and one defendant who had 2 lawyers went to trial. And so the judge let us watch the trial, even though it took us away from our work. And I watched these 2 guys, but the main chief lawyer for the defense, he just was amazing. He's like this old guy, bald head with a ring of white, deep voice, and so amazing. And it wasn't a factual defense, it was a legal defense, like about jurisdiction and whether the United States had the authority to get this ship in the high seas and international waters and pull it back in to be prosecuted in the US. So nobody was even claiming there weren't 72 tons of hashish on the boat, but so to me, it was just like amazing. It was pure law, but in this very dramatic setup. And the guy was so awesome. I was so blown away by him that like the day my externship ended and there wasn't any kind of conflict, we were never allowed to work on the case. We just got to watch. The judge had clerks that were actually lawyers who worked on the case with him, but the externs got to watch. And the day my externship ended, I sent the guy my resume because I was going to be heading into my 3rd year of law school, right? I was a second year. So that was the spring semester, 2nd year. So in the fall, I would be a 3rd year, had the whole year left. And I said, I would love to be a law clerk if you have, if you need a law clerk, I'm going to be a 3rd year at Berkeley. And I just was so blown away by the experience of watching your trial. And I sent him my resume and he hired me. And so I went to work for him as a 3rd year. And then he had a law partner. I worked for them for the last year of law school. And then I stayed on as eventually I became an associate, and which is just like a junior attorney. And I worked for them for another 4 years. So I worked for them for 5 years total before I ended up moving on to different types of criminal law jobs. But yeah, I started while in law school and basically from being completely inspired by his legal advocacy. I was so impressed by this guy. And I ended up getting to work on the appeal for that guy. And then he won his appeal. And then I got to work on his retrial. And it was just all very, very, very exciting to start with.
I mean, we're going to talk a little bit later in the video about how important different skill sets are in law school, how important networking is. But that right there is a great example of how important it is just to reach out and make connections while in law school. That grades matter, but also being a good, the type of assertive person, taking control over your own career and making those connections can really pay off.
Absolutely. And there's, law schools, and I think they're a little bit better now at trying to gear people for a variety of careers. When I was in law school in the 90s, they were still almost all the career support, the like institutional career support by career services was really geared toward getting people into big law firms, big corporate law firms. And the vast majority of law graduates don't actually go to big corporate law firms, right? And so it's kind of a weird disconnect. It's the most lucrative and sort of like high profile, but only a small percentage of law grads actually go to those firms.
Yeah.
The vast majority of them do a whole range of different cool careers, but you didn't get as much support to find those jobs and make those connections. I think they're slightly better now at doing that, but still not great. And so it's really on the people in school, the student, to kind of, I didn't know anybody. I knew nobody, but and it was through being on a law journal, which is something that is an opportunity. It's an academic / social experience to be on a law journal in law school. I was on the Berkeley Women's Law Journal, which is now the Berkeley Journal of Gender and Justice.
Oh, cool.
But I was an articles editor on that journal, and that journal was what connected me to the opportunity to be the extern, because there was an opening and a former editor from my journal was one of his law clerks, and she called our office and I answered the phone. So it was really there was a lot of just kind of reaching out personally and being willing to take risks. Yeah. And not expecting that the path is like actually set out in front of you and that people will point out the next step. Because if you've been in college, there is that in college. It's pretty like they're here. You have to take these classes, and then you'll, And then these are the options afterwards. And it gets less and less like that as you go. And in law school, at least when I was there was not a lot of guidance if you were going to do any path other than corporate law. And the funny thing is they would call all the other paths alternatives. Right? Alternative careers. And it's like, except for the vast majority of people do them. So I'm not sure why they're the alternative, but.
No, that is actually something I spoke about in a separate video with a couple of former colleagues of mine from when I was in big law. And while I was at GW, it was still very much that same mentality of gearing you towards one direction. And if you don't, quote, get that job, or you don't get the summer associate gig, then you've failed out of the whole process. So therefore we have to find some alternative for you. And you're absolutely right that vast majority of law students just simply don't go that route, and many don't want to go down that route.
Yeah, I didn't want to, but I also couldn't have. Like, I just wasn't cut out for that sort of work. It's not for everybody. My personality would not have gone over super well, especially again in the 90s. Things were even more restricted and less progressive than they are now. And I was not the right profile. In fact, I, as a protest, because the what's the name of the military JAG, the Judge Advocate General Corps, the JAG Corps. So they were interviewing in the on-campus interview process at Berkeley. And as part of my protest, as a member of the LGBTQ, caucus, we were called, I signed up for one of their interview slots to take one of their interview slots, and because military was not permitting queer people at that time at all. And so I was like, why are you not, the guy was like, another one of you.
You're already rebel rousing. You weren't even out of law school yet. So let me talk to you about your time though. So as a public defender, and then switching to the Innocence Project, because those are kind of two levels of criminal defense, and I think students would be interested in both of those things. Students that are wanting to do more nonprofit, more traditional defense. Talk to us about the difference and what that was like transitioning between those two.
Sure. And I did both. So the law office that I worked for first was a private criminal defense attorney. They did a mix of retained work, which is work where your client pays you, a retainer, and appointed work, which is similar to what public defenders are, where the county actually pays you, or the federal district if you're in the federal court. And so I did both with my first job, and then I went to a standard public defender's office, Contra Costa County public defender, and I worked there for a while. And then I went out and I actually had two different other private jobs, one with where I was the associate, and the other where I was a partner with two other lawyers. And so basically all of those years added up to 16 years in criminal defense. And the only difference between private defenders and public defenders is who pays, right? But the work is, I did trial work where I would have a client from the time of their arraignment, where they get the formal charges, and I get the packet of materials with police reports and forensic reports and things like that. And I'm working to prepare that client to either go to trial and defend the charges, or to come up with an appropriate plea bargain that is a fair outcome for the trial. 95% of cases settle by plea bargain, right? So the vast majority of your time is interviewing and doing investigation and following up to be sure that whatever it is that's going to happen at the end of the case is a fair result for your client. If it looks like there were violations of your client's rights, of course, you're doing litigating of things like suppression motions, trying to suppress evidence, or suppressing if you believe a statement was taken in violation of your client's Fifth Amendment privileges, you might be litigating that. All sorts of things that you're litigating, and then ultimately you're settling most cases, and then the small handful will go to trial. You actually do the trials. I also simultaneously did some appeals throughout my whole first 16 years, and that's because the attorneys that I worked for first had that mixed practice. It's not that common to do both trial and appeal, but there are a few small firms in San Francisco that were doing that, and they were one of them. And so right from the gate, I worked on appeals, which is less common and really fun. That's after someone has either gone to trial and been convicted, or if they've pled guilty but withheld reserved a right to appeal some legal issue. Something, for example, if there's a motion to suppress evidence under the Fourth Amendment, like the defendant is claiming that there was a violation of the reasonable, the police engaged in an unreasonable search and seizure. They did an unwarranted search, and found evidence that was used against me, and it should not have been seized because it was in violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. And so sometimes a person will plead guilty. They don't want to bother having a trial knowing that the introduction of all that evidence is going to get them convicted, but they are claiming that legally that evidence should never be used. Yeah. So they reserve that right, and they don't have a trial. They just go straight to appeal. They've pled guilty with reserving that right. And then the appeal is focused exclusively on, was there a violation of the Fourth Amendment here? And if so, should that evidence have been excluded? And if you win that appeal, you'll never end up going to trial. You'll just win. The case will get dismissed, right? Yeah. So we did a lot of that kind of stuff. And I did all that for 16 years in these different settings, and fun in sometimes, very, very, very stressful, hard to make a living, especially in your own practice. It's when public defenders make decent money in California, but I was only a public defender for like a year. I had been accustomed to private practice. I was my public defender office was an hour commute, and it was what's called a contract job, where I didn't have benefits and I didn't have a promise of continued employment. And it was very stressful for me to commute an hour for a job like that, paid almost nothing. It's like funny to tell you what the number of dollars that I got paid for that job. And so having already worked several years in private, I was like, that's the way to go. So I ended up doing that. But then I had kids, got married and had kids and stuff. And it's in order to make a good living as a private defense attorney, you really have to hustle, because you're a business person who's marketing yourself and, all that in addition to doing the actual legal work. So it's not easy to make a lot of money doing that. It's easy to make a sort of a survival amount of doing that. But then that was a very stressful way to live and I did it for a long time, but I got tired of the business part. I liked the law part, didn't like the business part. So I was kind of looking around, like paying bills one day and not liking it. And I saw a listing. I just literally Craigslist. I was on Craigslist legal jobs, had not been in any formal job search at all, had been in my law practice with my partners for 5 years at that point. And we were like always just breaking even. It was really stressful. And I saw, supervising attorney Santa Clara. And I'm like, supervising what? And I opened it, and it was the Northern California Innocence Project, which is a law clinic, right? So it's at a law school, and the students take it as a class. The students enroll for a year at a time. They are interns essentially, and they work for the staff attorneys who staff this place as a nonprofit. And it's a nonprofit organization whose focus is legal advocacy, both in court and at the legislature, right? So at the legislature, they're trying to make policy changes that will make it less likely that innocent people will get wrongfully convicted, changes of how eyewitness identifications are done, or recording of interrogations to prevent false confessions from going through, a variety of different sort of policy changes that would reduce the number of wrongful convictions. And then also policies around, for example, compensating people who got wrongfully convicted and who ultimately proved they were innocent, but spent 10 or 15 or 20 years in prison. So we want to do something to compensate them. So the innocence projects, which are all over the country, this one was in Northern California, work on that policy stuff in legislatures. And then the staff attorneys actually represent inmates who have claims of factual innocence. And so the main work there is investigating old cases. So you would get letters from the inmate, then you would send them a questionnaire, a very detailed questionnaire about their case. They send back the questionnaire. If they're claiming factual innocence, then you really do an investigation. You'll ultimately pull their trial transcript, and then you'll try to get their old file and find out what all the evidence was, figure out what the issue was. If there actually is some chance that they were innocent, there will be a reason that they got convicted anyway, what the problem is. So you have to go back and reinvestigate those problems, figure out. And then so my students would work with me there. I was a staff attorney there, and then I was the supervisor of the staff attorneys. And basically, it's very, very slow. Unlike trial law, where you're like, new case, new case, new case, new case. You're like working the same case for 2-3 years, because it's very painstaking to find old evidence. A lot of it hasn't been preserved, and old transcripts don't even have one unified way of being stored in California. So like, there's just, it's a whole like needle in a haystack kind of process. But it's cool because you work with students the whole time. And of course, the colleagues and the whole network of people working in wrongful conviction are just amazing. And the cool thing about wrongful conviction is that the exonerees, the clients, basically they become part of the family. When they get out, they just come back in, and they mostly want to help. They want to help the next person because they have had this terrible experience of injustice and then gotten help. So not every one of them, but many of them sort of come back around and want to do some kind of advocacy, whether it's being the person to talk at those legislative hearings about bills that we're trying to pursue, or telling their stories in various media settings. And some of them, start their own nonprofits, and some of them become lawyers. Occasionally there's been a few that have gotten an education and become lawyers because they really learned something from the terrible thing that happened to them. So it's the only kind of law that I've ever known where the clients become so intimately interconnected in an ongoing way when it's done. Like in criminal defense, I had a few clients who really came to love me and send me a Christmas card, but they're not in my work hanging out with me. and in the innocence world, they do. So that was really cool.
That's right. That sounds really interesting. And it sounds like an opportunity to explain to students that when we talk about, criminal defense work, it can take on different aspects, and that there is not one necessarily clear.
No, absolutely. And innocence work isn't criminal defense at all, actually. It is criminal law. You're working with criminal legal cases, but you're not defending because a person has already been convicted.
Yeah.
They're, by definition, if you're working on someone who's claiming that they were innocent, they've already been convicted. So there is no trial of them. They've already been tried or pled guilty or what have you. So what you're doing is called post-conviction work. So in criminal law, there's trial work, which may or may not actually lead to a trial, right? It most often will lead to a guilty plea, some kind of negotiated disposition, but that's trial level work, right? There's appellate work, which is the straight appeal that comes out of that trial level case. That means the legal issues that the defendant believes were not resolved appropriately, where there's a violation of their rights or there's a violation of a statute, there's some error. That's a straight appeal. And then there's something called post-conviction. And that is work that after the whole straight appeal process is done, post-conviction is the term of art for habeas corpus and associated legal challenges. After the whole direct appeal process is done, there still may be issues, and it has to be a constitutional issue. So you don't get to keep saying, but they got it wrong. I need a habeas corpus petition. They were wrong. It's not a claim. You have to have a constitutional claim, some fundamental right of yours that was violated in the process that happened. And that is what supports post-conviction relief. And so in innocence projects, and there are people that are not in innocence projects that do post-conviction law in criminal cases, but it's a much smaller practice area. So the vast majority of attorneys who are working in criminal law are at the trial level, right? That's the hugest part. That's the public defender offices around the country, et cetera. Then there's the smaller group that are doing appeals. Then there's a very, very small group that are doing post-conviction.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So we have a few different things kind of floating in the air in terms of, the pros and cons of taking this kind of lifestyle and practice. But why don't we talk in more concrete terms? So you mentioned here that, you can, in terms of, making it rich, you're probably not going to make it rich if you choose this kind of a career path. At the same time, it sounds like there are some really rewarding things. What are some other pros and cons that you might isolate for going down this path as an undergraduate wanting to go to law school, or as a law student that's choosing to go into some form of representation of a criminal?
Well, of the criminally accused, let's just say. And of course, there's also the other side. There's prosecutors who are criminal lawyers. So one thing is colleagueship. I would say that criminal attorneys, and this is both prosecutors and defense attorneys, and particular public defenders who work in bigger offices usually, there is a huge amount of colleagueship. There's a huge amount of mutual support among the people in your office. It's lower budget work than some other kinds of law. It's lower budget work than civil law across the board. Typically, there's just, it's funded by the public. Prosecutions are funded by the public defender. And so there's not a lot of, expense accounts and a lot of travel and things like that you might have in a civil job. But what you do have is other people around who have, criminal law is a high volume law. I mean, I'd love to see that change. I think we're over criminalizing, we're over prosecuting, and that's a whole political thing. But the fact is, it's currently a giant system with many, many, many new cases going through it all the time. And so because of that volume, you end up relying on the help of your colleagues who've had a certain issue, had a similar type of case. Oh, how did you approach this issue? How did you investigate this? Is there an expert who could consult with me on this kind of issue I'm having? So you really, really rely on other people's experience. And so and the best lawyers are people who are very good at doing that, at not inventing the wheel with every new case, but actually finding the things about their case where there's help available and utilizing that help, right? So that is a great thing about criminal law, because if you like working in a collaborative way, it's also, it's very much, you have your own case. Nobody else is going to do it for you, but people will collaborate, will give you feedback and advice and suggestions. And so I liked that. I liked the interaction with others. And of course, it's, again, whichever side you're on, if you're in that, it's very much driven by a sense of justice and wanting to help and wanting to make things better. For criminal defense attorneys, there's a sense of standing for the individual person who has so little power. Particularly a typical criminal defendant is someone who has very little money and has probably not had very many opportunities. The typical criminal defendant is poor. People of color far outnumber the white criminal defendants, in part because of over policing in communities of color, not at all because people of color are more likely to commit crimes, which statistically not. But I'm talking about the actual prosecution of cases, right? So who your clients are, the ability, the privilege to stand between this person who has not a lot of personal power and the government, which has too much power, right? So for criminal defense attorneys, there is a strong sense of like, we have a little bit of like, you know, savior stuff, like really wanting to help an individual who is in probably the worst situation of their life, or at minimum, even if it's a misdemeanor, in a bad situation, in a situation that's costing them money, that's keeping them from work, that might be keeping them from their kids. You know, you really, really want to help them. And there's this big giant force of the government, which basically seems to have unlimited funds to spend and unlimited time to like make your life difficult. So there is a real strong kind of emotional and, you know, just like a philosophical, like it feels very rewarding to represent the individual against the machine that is the government, at least for me and people that think like me, right? So that was very positive. And I felt like prosecutors that I knew, at least the ones I respect, were very much driven by their own sense of justice and wanting to help use their power to make good decisions and get rid of cases that really didn't belong there and only pursue the really righteous ones. So no matter which sort of side you come down on, there's definitely a lot of kind of emotional and philosophical and, you know, drive behind it. Like it's very rewarding to work in real people's lives and try to make a difference in real people's lives. And I say that as opposed to sort of corporate law, which is still real people, but one corporation versus another, it doesn't have that same kind of emotional resonance. You know, it's always about money. That's really all it's about, is, you know, which corporation should get the money and which one should give up the money in any given case. And whereas with criminal law, it's about real people's lives and the impact of, you know, how the criminal justice system interacts with real people's lives. And so,
Well, and it sounds too like especially the trajectory that you took, and maybe this is true with all kinds of forms of criminal law. A corporate attorney, the time that I spent as a corporate attorney was oftentimes doing very low level things within a very larger apparatus, and I'm one cog in a much bigger machine. Whereas for you, it sounded like you were in trials almost from day one. You were filing motions, you were appearing in court, you were in essence kind of handling and managing a case much earlier on in the process than say some other types of practice would have.
Absolutely. Criminal law has that. It's going for, again, the volume. It's so busy. There's not a lot of time for training, and there's not a lot of time to wait until you're really, really, really good at it before you handle things on your own. So even when I was still in law school as a clerk for this law firm, I was writing, I mean, my name didn't go on it, but I was writing portions of an appellate brief that went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, so that, the federal appellate court. I was writing sections of a brief that ultimately actually resulted in the guy getting his conviction overturned and getting a new trial. What an experience. I mean, here I was in law school, kind of baffled by my exams. Like, what do they want? I'm still not doing great. Why am I not, I don't seem to understand what they want. Yeah. Until I turned to an actual case and, a boss who actually, edited my work and like, no, fix this, and I ended up doing work that was like what people work for 20 years to get to do immediately while I was still a student. And then absolutely, when you're a public defender, my first day as a public defender, now granted, I had spent 4 years in private practice, but I hadn't done a trial by myself yet. Sure. My first day in public defender, I was handed 60 files. One of them, a couple of them were set for trial soon. One of them was set for trial in like a week and a half. And I went. It was a misdemeanor, but I did my first trial by myself like a week and a half into my job as a public defender, and I won it. And I only won a couple of other trials ever in my career. It's like not common to get a not guilty, let me just tell you. But it was misdemeanor battery. Those are defensible. Yeah. And I'll never forget the guy's name. I won't say it here. Michael S. is his last name. I remember the facts of the case, and it was a thrill, to do it myself, and so there is that, and you do have a lot of responsibility for sure. Yeah. I actually did 1 year in a civil law firm in the middle there. I was mad at one of my bosses, and before I ended up going in my own practice, I left him and spent a year. I thought I would just go make the money, and I did. I actually doubled my current pay, which was ridiculous, but yeah. I did 1 year, and at the end of the year, I gave notice on my 1 year anniversary, and I wanted to leave before they wanted me to leave, because they didn't want me to leave yet, but they would have eventually, because I just wasn't, I just couldn't bring what they want at a corporate firm, the number of hours per week doing the kind of work that I'm not interested in doing. Like, I can do that number of hours if I'm compelled by the case, but when what you're doing is digging through discovery stuff and, answering interrogatories, and it wasn't for me. So
it gets old fast, for sure.
It gets old really fast for a certain kind of person. I'm an interactive person. I want to be having interesting conversations all day. And in criminal law, that is, that is not hard to do at all. Like, that is just the nature of it. The downside is that it is very emotionally taxing. Absolutely. And again, not necessarily lucrative, although you can totally make a living. Totally make a living. Especially as a public defender in California, they make decent money. They really do. And in some states in the country, it's so underfunded that they don't make decent money, and that's really sad. But in California, public defenders make a really, very, very respectable income. So you can have a family and all that kind of stuff. And, private practice is different just because you have all the expenses and everything. But yeah, you can totally make a decent living. People who work at big law, though, they make more comparable to sort of, the financial industry and things like that, right? And that's different from, that's not what normal average middle class Americans make,
Well, and what you're bringing out too is if you want to pursue the kind of career path that you're talking about here, this underscores what I've been telling the students, and what I think it would be hard not to know is that choosing the right law school where you don't take on the kind of debt that then forces you to have to choose those big high level salaries and sacrifice multiple years of your life. You go to the right law school, a place that hopefully even pays for you to go there, and then you have that opportunity to choose these career paths that may not be making the six-figure salaries, but you're living comfortably.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The law school debt cycle thing is really shameful, Yeah. So yeah, to the extent you can get it financed, if you can, there are certain kinds of agencies that will pay for your law school if you work for them. There's, just be creative or go to the least expensive. I mean, I'm so grateful. Now I know that Berkeley costs a lot more. All the schools have gone up, but I was able to pay off my law school debt in 10 years. I borrowed it all. I didn't have any money going into law school. But it was so inexpensive because it was a state school, that at the time it was an affordable education. And so yeah, definitely look for that. You got to look for that, find a way to make it work financially. Don't just be like, oh, I'll just borrow $300,000 and it'll be fine, because that is creating a lot of problems right now, as you are probably aware.
I've got two last questions for you, and I think both of them will be really interesting questions. The first is, so oftentimes the way that media portrays criminal work in any sense, and the way historically it's been handled, is we think white male, institutionalized, Clarence Darrow, Atticus Finch type folks. The legal industry has historically, for many centuries, been a white male privileged position. How did you navigate through that, Maitreya, in a world that tended to be driven by one type of gender, one type of background? What advice would you give to students who are, say, women, students of color, people who don't come from those privileged backgrounds? What are some thoughts that you have in order to navigate that in the criminal law world?
Yeah, well, what I would say, for one thing, you're starting out in a better position than in some places by being in California. California is such a diverse state, and the legal industries in California are diverse. Now, you go to big law and you will start to see that, well, nope, not so diverse. And it's still typically, although the gender diversity is getting, the gender balance is getting slightly better, at least at the introductory level. They kind of go in even numbers. As you start to go up the corporate ladder, the women fall off. We know about just the whole conversation about the unpaid work of motherhood, et cetera, but and discrimination. But I would say in criminal law, and of course, I'm not talking stats. I haven't done any research on it or even really read studies, but and certainly you see occasional stats in articles and things, but women certainly are equally represented. Like I in public defender's offices, and depending on the public defender's office, there is not as much leadership among women as there is among men, but there are a lot of trial deputies that are women in every public defender office I've ever stepped into. And that's been a lot because as a private attorney, I moved around a lot and, would appear in different counties. And so it's very welcoming to women. I would say it's very much regional in terms of ethnic and racial opportunity, like in the Bay Area and all of the big, in LA, in the big urban markets, there's a huge number of attorneys of color in public defender offices and even in district attorneys' offices, much more so than kind of similar level of legal expertise in other types of law. In criminal law, I think a lot of people are drawn, people of color will be like, I want to do something. My students I have a huge number, like Latina women are like a giant portion of my student body at Chico State. And there's so many of them that want to go into criminal law in one way or another. They either want to do attorneys or they want to be, corrections or probation. They are driven by a desire to impact communities that they grew up in a positive way, and to be part of changing the system to be less abusive and mercenary and more service oriented, right? And so I get that story a lot from my students, and I see that in my career. There are many, 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 many people of color involved in various staff kind of work and everything. So, and of course I was in the Bay Area most of the time, which just is a better mix of ethnicities in terms of like opportunity and people getting promoted. And the public defenders for the last 20 years have been men of color, the public defender, like at the top of the office. And the DA was Kamala Harris for a bunch of years, and then George Gascon. So it was a woman of color and then a gentleman of color. And so, it's San Francisco. It's better than Fresno, but even Fresno has improved in the last 20 years in terms of its hiring practices. So I would say, for me, navigating the woman thing is, I hate to say it, but there's just like sexism is so entrenched, is so like the patriarchy is the water we're swimming in. Yeah. So women do have, we have to kind of have an extra coat of armor and navigate like stupidity, sorry to say, that's out there. Ginger Rogers said something like, she had to do everything that Fred Astaire did just
But
as well, but backwards in heels. And that's kind of, I mean, that is kind of the experience of women. And I don't say that as like in a whiny way. It's just my observation,
yeah,
but luckily we can. And I have been blown away by watching, since I was in law school 25 years ago, watching how much more opportunity women have created for themselves.
yeah,
So, I think it's still there's so much inequity that's still just in the system. So you will see it when you just look at the distribution. But I wouldn't want any of your students to ever believe they were not going to be able to reach the highest heights of whatever field, especially in criminal law, because on the virtue of like having come from a poor background or being a person of color, being a woman, I didn't come in with any money. I had certain kind of privilege just from being white, but our field is more merit-based than most fields are. And you just get in and you are really hungry, you can make a way for yourself, and there's way more community and support in
yeah,
criminal law than there is in sort of white collar, or corporate law. There just are more people. There is more of a peer support network, and there are people ahead of you on the path who have been very successful, who want to be sure that the next generation of attorneys and people of color are getting the right support. So it's a better field than many, especially within law, for knowing that you're not going to have to like kill yourself to advance.
yeah. Well, that's good. I appreciate you offering that perspective. That's that I know that's something that my students care about very deeply. My last question is this, and this is one that I'm asking of everybody that I talk to. If you could go back in time to the person that you were stepping out of undergrad, you knew that you wanted to go to law school, certainly even when you were a young woman. But if you could go back in time from where you are now to where you were then, what's something that you wish you could tell your undergraduate self about this law school journey? Or maybe to put it another way, is there any advice that you would pass on to an undergraduate who is thinking, gosh, I really do want to go to law school? What are your thoughts?
Man, see, this one's a tough one. I'm a little too much of a Star Trek fan, and so the whole idea of changing the past, which would completely change the present,
Right.
I really had no idea what I was getting into.
Mm.
And while I personally I can say now, where I am teaching undergraduates legal studies, I am teaching pre-law students, and I am so, so happy. And there were times at every position that I ever had that I was happy, but I really did not love a lot of what I had to do, like what my tasks were, right? I love what my tasks are as a teacher. Um, so, so I wouldn't want to change it. Everything I did is what led me to being the person I am and being able to teach in the way that I can. And I wouldn't have been the same teacher if I had just gone and gotten a PhD. And I would not have I would have been a completely different teacher. And maybe that would have been fine, but I love the life that I have, and I built it with all these components. And so I wouldn't want to tell young me not to do it, but I would want to tell young you, because an awful lot of people have a similar type of disillusionment when they arrive at law school, and being baffled, like, uh-oh, what have I done now? And especially if you're going to be borrowing money to do it. Know what law school actually is, like what happens at law school, what work you do at law school, what sort of classes are going to be available to you at law school. And know this class is a great thing to find out, like what people actually work on, right? Because I didn't know that, and I got to law school and expected it to be very intellectually exciting, and like a lot of talk about justice and a lot of really amazing, collaborative conversations with brilliant professors about justice. And that is not what happens in law school.
No.
It is dry to the bone. It is dry and technical, and like reading ancient cases that don't even really make sense to try to glean the legal rule out of them. And it is not very fun.
Yeah.
If you have a particular kind of thing that you want to do as a lawyer, I want to be a criminal lawyer, I'm passionate about representing the accused, then it's worth it. You go forth and you do what it takes to go through law school, and you'll have a good career because you care about that. But if you're just like, I think that law would be a good field because, you know, it's a good field for professionals, and I'm smart and I do well, and I think lawyering would be a good, that is not a good enough reason.
Yeah.
Trust me, because it's not, it's just, yeah, you really, it's so I don't like to, I kind of feel like I have like this dual role of like those who really want to do it, and they really want to do it. I want to facilitate their doing it. I want them to have the best possible, you know, smoothest pathway to getting in and doing well at law school. And that's what I'm teaching. But I also am really trying to help pick off the people that are just kind of, for lack of a better choice, are thinking law school would be a good option.
Yeah.
Because it's expensive and both overwhelmingly a lot of work and boring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I found it boring. And so, you know, that's real, right?
Yeah.
Like, now if on the other side you have a real, like, I really want to do this thing, then I think it's worth it. And
Yeah.
for me, it is worth it. It was worth it for me. I'm glad I did it, but I wish I had known. I might have done something else.
Well, yeah, you need that fuel that will keep your engine running through all those moments of drudgery, not just in law school, but in your practice as well. You got to have something that's lighting that fire within you. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Maitreya, thank you so much for talking with me today. This was fantastic. And students, if you have any questions for Maitreya, you can absolutely pass those along to me, and I will reach out to her. She's also publicly available online through Chico State. So you're also welcome to reach out to her as well. But thank you so much, Maitreya.
My pleasure.
It was great
Good to see you,
talking.
Adam.
All right, you too. Take care.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.